Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. In this exercise, exercise 47, we're going to focus on automated testing, specifically on working with nose test. So in the previous exercise, we already set up a basic project structure, which we can now use to work with new projects and to automatically test new features that we're working on. Because if we manually test the different features, for example, of the game that we developed before, it can get quite annoying and boring to test the same capabilities over and over again. And in order to facilitate that and automate that a bit more, we can just write test cases and then run our tests, which automatically will test if our code is working correctly. These automated tests that we are going to write may not catch all the bugs that are introduced in our code, but they will definitely reduce the amount of time that we need to spend in order to test our application manually. So going forward, every exercise that we are working on in the rest of this book will not have a what you should see section, as we had so far, where we had the output displayed that we should see when we run the code, but instead it will have a what you should test section. So from now on, we will actually write our own tests, our automated test cases, and that will hopefully help us to become even better programmers. And it's really important to be able to write automated tests, since this is something that every programmer basically should know. So that as we write new code, we are able to test the new applications, the new code that we are writing. All right, so let's get started and actually write our first own test case. And here we are going to rely on what we wrote in the previous exercise, our skeleton project, and we're actually going to copy that over and use that as a basis to write our test case. So here are the steps that we're going to follow. First of all, we are going to copy the skeleton directory that we created in the previous exercise to a new folder called exercise 47. Next, we're going to rename everything which has a placeholder name in it to exercise 47. And of course, going forward, we would, when we create our own projects, always replace it with the actual project name. And then we're going to change the word name also in all the files to exercise 47, so that it's consistent and uses the right project name. And finally, we're going to remove all the .pyc files. Those are temporary files that are created as the Python scripts that we write get compiled. This way we can make sure that our code is clean. And there will also be some cached files that are created. Those we can also delete. So let's get started and let's open our terminal here. And at the moment I'm in our projects directory, which we created in the previous exercise. Let's just take a look, and we see we have the skeleton directory inside of it. So let's get started with the first step to actually copy our skeleton project over to exercise 47. So for this, we can type in CP for copy. And since our skeleton directory here contains other directories and other files, we need to add the flag -r to recursively copy the entire content in the skeleton directory. And after that, we can provide the name of the directory we want to create. So in this case, exercise 47. And actually, I made a typo here. So we need to, of course, specify what we want to copy. So here we need to add skeleton followed by exercise 47. That means we are going to recursively copy the content of skeleton over to a new directory called exercise 47. Let's check that out, and we can see we now have a new directory. Let's switch to it by typing in cd and then the name of the directory. And now our prompt has changed and we are inside of the exercise 47 directory. Let's just take a look at it, and we can see we have the same folders, the same directories and files that we set up in the skeleton project. Now let's continue and actually rename everything with name in it to exercise 47. So to do that, we can use the move command, mv, followed by name, which is going to be what we are moving and therefore basically also renaming. And we are going to move or rename it to exercise 47. Let's check that again, and we can now see we now have exercise 47 in here instead of name. Now if we switch into the exercise 47 directory, which we just created, let's take a look at that. We have those files in here, this is fine. If we go back, we can actually take a look at our setup.py Python file. And in there, I believe we also need to replace name with our actual exercise 47 project name. So here, of course, we could fill out all the description, our project information, author name, so on and so forth. Here specifically, I want to rename packages to exercise 47. And let's just rename our project also to exercise 47. Now there's another file, of course, that we have, which is the file inside of test. So let's switch over to the tests folder. Let's take a look. And here we have name_tests.py. Now in the third step, actually, we should rename all the files that have name in them to exercise 47. So we can already do that and say we want to rename name_tests.py to exercise 47_tests.py. Let's take another look, and we can see it's now displayed. It's the right name. And now let's open up that file in our code editor. So in this case, here with Visual Studio Code. And here, instead of importing name, of course, we need to rename that to exercise 47. Let's save that and close it again. And finally, the last step is to remove all the .pyc files to make sure that our directory is clean. So let's navigate back up one folder here, and we can use the tree command just to take a look at the entire folder structure here. And we can see that we actually have those PyCache directories here, and for example, inside of the test directory, we have those PYC files, and the PyCache file, those files get generated automatically, but we can basically delete the directory here with all the content. So because that would all be generated automatically when we run the tests. So let's do that. And since we want to delete not just the files, but also the cache directory here, I'm going to use the -r flag to recursively delete the data. And then we're going to navigate to exercise 47 and remove the PyCache directory here. And of course, we need to do the same step one more time to do that with the test directory here with the PyCache folder. All right, let's run the tree command one more time. And that looks a lot cleaner. Now we only have our init.py file inside of exercise 47, inside of tests, and also our exercise 47_tests.py file. So this way we created now our new folder structure. We renamed everything. Let's see if it works properly by running nose tests. And let's see if we get any errors. No, that looks good. So we see we ran one test here and the status is okay. So that looks good. And as always, we need to make sure that when we run the command nose tests, run our tests, that we do that outside of any of those directories. So we don't want to do that inside of tests, but we want to navigate up here to our exercise 47, to our project directory. And from here we can then run nose tests, and then it runs the tests and we see if they've run successfully. All right, so that was the setup. Now let's actually get started with our project itself. And to get started, we want to create a new file inside of our exercise 47 folder called game.py. And this is where we can put the code to test. So this would actually be the production code that we write, for example, our game code. And then later on, we would create a separate file, a separate test file to actually test the code in here. And this is a very simple file. Of course, we are just defining a class here called room. And then we have 3 different methods inside of that basically just initialize the room here with a name, a description, and some path. And then we have 2 additional methods here. One is go, which allows us to go in a certain direction. And the other one is to add an additional path here. So let's do that by, first of all, navigating inside of our exercise 47 file that we created. And here we can now create a new file called game.py. And I'm using Visual Studio Code, so I'm adding code to it. If you're using a different text editor, then feel free to adjust that, for example, to atom space game.py. Now let's confirm that, and then we are opening up our text editor, and we can just start out by writing out our code here. So let's first define our class here, room, and this has an init class which takes 3 parameters, self, name, and description. Self.name should be initialized to name, and as always we should type this out, so we build up some muscle memory writing our code here. And then we have self.path, which is a dictionary. Now next we have the go method, which accepts 2 arguments, self and description. And we just return self.path.get. We pass direction and none to it. And finally we have the add path method. And of course we always have to make sure to pass self as an argument so that we can actually run our methods here when we work with our class. But in these cases we have at least 1 additional argument that we need to provide, in this case pass. Alright, and that's the code here. Let's save it. And then what we need to do is we need to change our unit test skeleton file to this file here. So if we take a look again at our project structure here, and let's navigate up, and you can see it automatically created PyCache again here since we ran those tests, but this is fine. This is not going to affect our code here. So what we need to do is we just created the production file in our project folder in exercise 47. Now in order to test that properly, we need to adjust the files in the tests folder. So this way we always split up our code in the production code inside of our project folder and into our tests, which are inside the tests folder. So here let's switch over to tests. And here we have exercise 47_tests.py. This is the one that we want to adjust. And of course, if we have a lot of functionalities that we want to test, maybe we have additional classes and separate files, which are inside of exercise 47, we can create separate test files for those inside of the tests folder. Now in here, this is our boilerplate, our template code. We need to adjust that. The first line here, of course, where we import nose, our testing tool, stays the same. But now we actually want to go ahead and say that instead of just importing exercise 47, we want to say that from our exercise 47 folder, we want to import the room class inside of our game file. And now we have a number of test cases that we add, a total of 3 test cases. And we can see that we want to test the room itself, which is basically the creation of our class. So if we just take a look up here, we set up the room class, and here's the init method. And what we do in the first test case here, we are testing if the initialization of our room works properly. So here, for example, we create a new room, we pass the name and the description to it. So we call it gold room here. And that is assigned to our object, to the gold object here. And then we are using the assert equal command, which is a command provided by nose, which checks if gold.name, which is taking the gold object, so the instance of the room class here, and the attribute name, which again is the attribute here that we used when we instantiated the object. We check if that, which should be equal to the name that we provided, so gold room, if that is actually equal to gold room. And then we also check that gold.pass is actually empty, which is what we initialize it at. So that's the first test case. After that, we are testing the room pass capability. And here specifically, we create three different rooms, center, north, and south. And then we are using the addPath method, which is up here, to add those two paths to it, so north and south. And then we check if, using again assert equal, if center go north is then equal to north, and if center go south is equal to south. And finally, we have our test map test case, which is the third one. Again, we create three different rooms. We add paths to it, 3 in total, and then we check that when we call assert equal and we use the go method here, start go west, that is equal to west, start go west, go east is equal to start. So we basically chain those together, and at start go down, start go up is equal to start, which is the initial room here. So these are some very basic tests, but this basically shows us how we would generally structure our test cases, and that we can use specifically assert equal to check if two statements, so our method call here, for example, and for example an object here or some variable, or actually also some string as up here, is actually equal. And ideally, of course, we would type this out. For time's sake, I'm actually going to just copy that over for now. So we are going to select this here. And then just insert it into our file. And of course, we need to be careful with those copy paste when we copy and paste code, because we need to make sure that the indentation is correct, which should be the case here, however. So we copied that over, and now we have our exercise 47_tests.py file, and of course we have our game.py file, which is inside of our project folder inside of exercise 47. And important to mention here, we are of course importing the room class from our exercise 47.game module, which is the game.py file inside of our exercise 47 project directory, so that we can actually test it. So it's always important, of course, to make sure that we import the relevant modules and the relevant classes that we actually want to test. And in general, our tests always and our tests that we are executing then always start with test underscore. So here we have test underscore map, or for example test underscore room that we are creating. We need to set up the rooms and initialize them, basically create new objects based on that, and then we can perform our tests. And as mentioned before, assert equal is the important function that we are working with, that nosetest provides, so that we actually can check if two statements are equal. And if that's not the case, then nosetest will print out an error message so that we can figure out what the actual issue is. So let's take a look at some testing guidelines. So when we are creating our own tests, we should generally follow those guidelines. So test files always go inside of the tests directory, and they're always named some name underscore tests.py. So we always have to have that underscore tests.py in there. Otherwise, nosetests here won't run them. And that is also a good idea because that keeps our tests from crashing with our other code, because due to this underscore test.py, we also avoid that we have identically named files in the tests directory and in our project directory. We should write one test file for each module that we make. So if we just take a look again at our project structure here, and we go up one level, and ideally we just run tree real quick. So if we have inside of our project directory here additional modules, additional files, so aside from game.py, maybe an additional file called something maybe setup.py. Actually, setup.py is a bad example because this is actually on the level up here, but maybe some engine.py or some other file that we are adding here, then we should set up a separate test file for that. So here we would then add an additional file for that to test it. We should keep our test cases, the functions, short, but should not worry if they are a bit messy. So since test cases are usually a little bit messy. So even though test cases are messy, we should try to keep them clean and remove any repetitive code that we can remove. We can also create helper functions that get rid of duplicate code. So helper functions are basically some code that we can reuse in different files. So we don't have to rewrite the same code in multiple files, but we can just basically specify that in such a helper function and then use that in different places. And finally, we should not get too attached to our tests. Sometimes the best way to redesign something is just to delete it and then start over. All right, so we set up our production code, our game.py code inside of our project folder, and also our test cases into our tests folder. Now, if everything has been set up correctly, we should be able to run nose tests and see that we execute those 3 tests that we specified before. So let's just take a look at that and run nose tests. And see if that works. So here we actually have an error. So in return self.path.get, and this is inside of game.py. So I probably have a typo in there. So let's switch over to the directory and just open game.py. Let's just double check real quickly. There's probably just some missing character, some typo in there. And just to save a bit of time, I'm just going to select that code here and copy it over and save. And now let's go back here. Let's go up one level and let's run nose tests one more time to see if that fixed the error. Yes, so most likely there was a typo that I added in here. So now it runs correctly. The 3 tests have been executed. Status OK. So that means we successfully tested our functionality, and the assert equal statements here actually returned what they were supposed to return. So let's try however to cause an error and see what that looks like, and then we can fix it. So if we just take a look again at our test cases here in our test file, we see that, for instance, here in the test room, we instantiate our room class and we set the name gold room to it. And then we are checking if gold.name is equal to gold room. So here, if we just say we are calling this gold rooms, we just add an S to it, then this should actually show us that there's an error, because now gold rooms is not equal to gold room. So we should get back an error. Let's just see if that's indeed the case. And we can always type just the up arrow on our keyboard here within that inside the terminal. Then we see the last command. And let's press enter one more time. And now we see indeed that there's an error. So assert equal gold.name and gold room is not identical. There's an assertion error. It tells us here gold rooms with an S is not equal to gold room without an S. And here we basically see that is a different here. The S character is indeed not what we expect. So let's change that back to gold room, save the file, and run our tests again, and then they should work properly. And of course, as we are developing especially more complex capabilities, we can write our tests, and then as we write additional features, just test them occasionally, and our tests will then show us if there's any error in our code. So let's take a look at the study drills section here. So the first exercise is to read more about nose tests and also about some testing alternatives. So if we just take a look at the nose documentation, and I will also link that in the description below. Nose basically extends unit tests to make testing easier here. So here are some general instructions about how to install Nose. Of course, we installed that in the previous exercise using pip, the Python package manager. And here we can see basically how we can run nose test and what the output is, so how many tests have been run and in what time, and if the status is okay or if there are any errors in there. And here at the bottom we can also find some documentation links. So testing with knows how to write, find and run tests using Node. So we can just click on that to get some more information. And here we can find the basic usage, basically how to write tests specifically. Let's just jump to that section. And there are a lot of additional capabilities. So we can add fixtures which are used to set up and tear down methods inside of our test cases. We can then use test functions, for example, assert, which we saw before as assert equals, and a lot of additional options, for example, test generators here. So let's take a look at some alternatives to nose, and that's just what I googled for, and two examples showed up. So PyTest, for example, is one alternative to nose, or unit test. So those are two options. Unit test here is part of the Python standard library, so it automatically comes with Python basically. And of course there are a lot of other options available. So for the next exercise, let's learn about Python's doc tests and see if we like them better. So if we head over to the Python docs, we can see that there's a documentation on doc tests to test interactive Python examples. So the doc tests module here searches for pieces of text that look like interactive Python sessions, which of course we can start from the terminal by just typing in Python. And then it executes those sessions to verify that they work exactly as shown. And there are several common ways to use doc tests to check a module's doc strings, that they are up to date, verifying all interactive examples still work as documented, and also to perform regression testing and to write tutorial documentation for a package, for example. So here we would have an example here, an example module. So we can see that we define a function here, and then we can basically execute that and run those tests. So that would be an alternative to using nose tests. That's a bit closer to actually the Python interpreter in terms of how it looks like. Finally, let's take a look at some common student questions. The first one is, I get a syntax error when I run nose tests. So if that happens, then we should take a look what the error says and fix that line of code or the ones above it. That's actually what we had before when we ran the tests and we saw that something was wrong in the room class. There was a typo in there and we needed to fix that in order to run the test successfully. So what happens if I can't import exercise 47.game, which is what we did inside of our test case at the very top? We need to make sure that we create init.py inside of our exercise 47 folder. If we haven't done that before, we should take a look at exercise 46, which is a previous video, to see how that's done. So we need to set up that project skeleton, and then we can use that as a basis for this exercise here. If that's not the problem, then we can do this on Mac OS or Linux. We can export Python path, or on Windows here, we need to execute this command here. And then finally, if that still doesn't fix it, we can test that we are running the tests indeed with nose tests and not just Python. So I get user warning when I run nose test. If that happens, you probably have 2 versions of Python installed, or you aren't using distribute. Go back and install distribute or pip as described in the previous exercise. So we need to check that in order to properly run the tests. So that's it for exercise 47 and automated testing. And I see you guys next time in exercise 48.